So, this all started back when I was in college, maybe my sophomore year. I needed a job, something to cover rent for my tiny off-campus apartment and maybe have a little left over for cheap beer and pizza. I ended up finding this gig at a little clothing boutique called the Gilded Hanger. It wasn't in the trendy part of town, more on one of those quiet side streets that people used as a shortcut. It was a nice place, though. Small, independent, run by a guy named Mark, who was mostly hands-off as long as the numbers added up at the end of the month. My shift was the best part, or at least I thought so at the time. I was the opener. I had to be there at 8 in the morning, a full 2 hours before we actually opened for business. The whole point was to get the store ready in peace. I had a key. I'd let myself in, and for 2 hours that little shop was my own private, quiet world. I'm a creature of habit, I guess you could say. I find comfort in routine, and this job was nothing but. The routine was always the same. I'd park my beat-up Civic down the street where parking was free, walk the block and a half, the city still sleepy and gray around me. The key would make this specific, satisfying ka-chunk sound in the lock. I'd push the heavy glass door open, and the first thing that would hit me was the smell. It was a weird mix of new fabric, a faint floral air freshener, and the dust motes dancing in the single sliver of light that cut through the front window. First, flip the main breaker. The long fluorescent tubes overhead would hum and flicker to life with a sound like a tired sigh. Then, the accent lights, a series of warmer spotlights aimed at the key displays. Then, music. We had this old CD player behind the counter, and I'd always put on the same mellow indie folk playlist. It was just background noise, something to fill the silence. The next hour and a half was pure, mindless work. I'd start by refolding the sweaters that browsers had messed up the day before. I'd straighten the rows of jeans, making sure the sizes were all in order. I'd pick up stray tags and hangers from the floor. I'd sweep. The soft shush-shush of the broom against the polished concrete floor a familiar rhythm. It was boring, but it was predictable. And, in a life filled with surprise exams and broke college student drama, predictable was good. Predictable was safe. In the very center of the store, right in the main walkway, was our one and only mannequin. Mark was really proud of her. He called her the, quote, centerpiece. She was made of that glossy white fiberglass with abstract, featureless facial features. Just a smooth oval for a head and subtle bumps for a nose and lips. No hair, no painted-on eyes, just blankness. Every Monday, it was Mark's job to dress her in what he considered the outfit of the week. My job was just to make sure she always looked perfect. No dust on her shoulders, no wrinkles in her dress. We jokingly called her Florence. Florence was part of my routine. After the sweeping, I'd always do a final once-over. Check on Florence. Make sure her skirt was hanging just right, that the necklace she was wearing was centered. She was always facing the front door, her posture rigid and a little aloof. Her arms were usually set in some kind of chic, unnatural pose. One hand on her hip, the other hanging loosely at her side. That Tuesday morning started just like any other. Key in the lock, lights on, music playing. I refolded a mountain of pastel cardigans, reorganized a rack of summer dresses, and swept the floor. Finally, it was time to check on Florence. I grabbed my dust rag and walked toward the center of the store, and that's when I noticed it. It was small. So small that for a second my brain didn't even register it as being wrong. Florence's right arm wasn't at her side. It was raised slightly. The plastic hand was bent at the wrist, the fingers held together, angled up in a way that looked, for all the world, like a shy, tentative wave. I stopped dead, my dust rag halfway to her shoulder. I just stared at it. It wasn't a dramatic change. It wasn't like she was dabbing or pointing at the ceiling. It was just off. The pose was stiff, awkward. A mannequin isn't designed to look natural, but this looked unnaturally natural. Like someone had tried to pose a doll and didn't quite get the joints right. My first thought, the logical one, was Mark. He must have stopped by after I left last night to drop something off and knocked into it by accident. That had to be it. He was a bit of a clumsy guy. It was the only explanation that made any sense. I told myself that. I repeated it in my head. Mark was here, he must have bumped it. But a little voice in the back of my mind, a tiny, cold little voice, whispered, "But why would he leave it like that?" Mark was meticulous about the store's appearance. He would have fixed it. He wouldn't have left Florence looking like she was trying to hail a cab. I shook my head, trying to physically dislodge the thought. "You're being stupid, Anna," I muttered to myself, the words sounding loud in the empty store. I was probably just misremembering. Maybe she was posed like this yesterday, and I just didn't notice. I was tired. I had been up late, studying for a midterm. That was a much better explanation. I was tired, and my memory was fuzzy. I reached out and took hold of the mannequin's plastic arm. It was cool and smooth to the touch. I pushed it down, and the joint in the shoulder resisted for a moment before giving way with a soft grinding click. I carefully repositioned it back to the standard pose, one hand on the hip, the other down. There. Normal again. I finished my dusting, and went behind the counter to count the cash drawer, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like an itch under my skin. I kept glancing up from the register, my eyes darting to the center of the room. Florence stood there, perfectly still, exactly as I had left her. Motionless. Lifeless. Of course she was. She was a chunk of fiberglass. But the image of that weird little wave was burned into my brain. It hadn't been threatening. It hadn't been overtly scary. It was just wrong. An error in the code of my predictable, safe routine. A single note played out of key in a familiar song. It was enough to make the whole melody feel strange. I spent the rest of my prep time feeling jumpy. The normal, comforting sounds of the store, the hum of the lights, the soft music, suddenly seemed to be hiding other, smaller sounds I couldn't quite hear. Was that the wind, or something shifting in the stockroom? Was that the ice machine in the cafe next door, or footsteps? I was just being paranoid. I knew it. But the feeling wouldn't leave. At 5 minutes to 10, I did my final check. I walked to the front, ready to unlock the door and flip the little hanging sign from closed to open. I took one last look around the tidy, perfect space. My eyes, as if pulled by a magnet, landed on Florence one more time. She stood there, bathed in the warm glow of the accent lights, wearing a stylish blue sundress. Her arms were exactly where I had put them. Her body was angled perfectly towards the door. Everything was normal. But then, for just a fraction of a second, I swear it was just a trick of the light, a flicker from the old fluorescent bulbs. I saw her head move. It didn't turn. It just tilted. A tiny, almost imperceptible incline to the left, as if she were looking directly at me. As if she were curious. I blinked hard, a jolt going through me like a shot of ice water. My heart hammered against my ribs once, twice. I stared, holding my breath. Nothing. She was perfectly still. Her head was straight, facing the door, exactly as it should be. The smooth, blank face was just a surface for the light to play on. That's all it was. A trick of shadow and light, and my own exhausted mind. "Get a grip, Anna," I whispered, my voice a little shaky. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Too much coffee. Not enough sleep. That's what it was. That's all it could be. I turned my back on her, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the lock on the door. But, as I flipped the sign to open, I couldn't shake the feeling, cold and heavy in the pit of my stomach, that when I wasn't looking, she was still watching me. For the next few days, Wednesday and Thursday, nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. And the thing is, the quiet was almost worse. My own mind became the enemy. Every time I walked into the shop, my eyes would snap to the center of the room before I even hit the light switch, my heart doing this stupid little flutter in my chest. But Florence was always there, exactly as she should be. Facing the door, arms in her designated pose, wearing a ridiculously expensive silk blouse and skirt combo. Normal. I convinced myself I had hallucinated the whole thing. The wave, the tilt of the head. It was textbook exhaustion. I'd been pulling all-nighters for my sociology midterm, fueling myself with gas station coffee in sheer panic. People see things when they're that tired. It's a scientific fact. I repeated that to myself like a mantra every morning as I swept the floor, the shush-shush of the broom, a comforting return to the routine I desperately needed. Predictable was safe. The little blip on Tuesday had just been a system error in my brain. It was fine. I was fine. By Friday morning, I had almost entirely forgotten the incident. I'd aced my midterm, gotten a solid 8 hours of sleep, and even treated myself to a real latte instead of the usual sludge. I walked the familiar block and a half to the gilded hangar feeling light, almost cheerful. The city was waking up, rays of golden sun cutting between the buildings. It was going to be a good day. I put the key in the lock. The familiar ka-chunk echoed in the quiet street. I pushed the heavy glass door open, the scent of new fabric and floral air freshener washing over me. "Morning, Florence," I said out loud, a silly little habit I'd picked up. I reached for the main breaker on the wall to my left and flipped it. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, sputtered, and flickered on. The store was bathed in their flat, sterile light. And I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. The latte suddenly felt like a cold stone in my stomach. My cheerful mood evaporated, replaced by a surge of ice-cold dread that started in my feet and shot straight up my spine. Florence was not facing the door. She was not facing the street. She was turned a full 90 degrees to her left. Her blank, featureless face was aimed directly, precisely, at the heavy velvet curtain of the main dressing room. Her pose wasn't an accident. It wasn't a slight nudge. Her entire torso and base had been rotated. One arm was still on her hip, but the other, the one that had been hanging loose, was now slightly raised, her plastic fingers pointing towards the curtain's opening. An invitation. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was wrong on a fundamental level. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation, for anything other than the screaming, illogical conclusion that was forming in my mind. A break-in. That had to be it. Someone broke in. A prank. Some dumb kids found a way in and thought this would be a hilarious joke. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move. My first stop was the door I had just come through. I checked the deadbolt. It was still thrown, locked from the inside. I had been the one to unlock it. I ran to the back, my sneakers squeaking on the polished concrete. The stockroom door was a heavy steel thing. I yanked on the handle. Locked. I fumbled with the key, unlocked it, and pushed my way in. The room was stuffy and smelled of cardboard. There was a single, high window near the ceiling, barred from the outside and covered in a thick layer of grime. It was latched shut from the inside. The emergency exit door was secured with a heavy crossbar, also from the inside, untouched. I backed out of the stockroom, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. There was no way in, and no way out. Not without a key. Besides me, only Mark had a key. My hands were shaking as I pulled my phone from my pocket. My thumb slipped twice before I managed to find Mark's contact. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" His voice was gravelly with sleep. "Mark? Hey, it's Anna. Sorry to call so early." My voice came out as a squeak. I cleared my throat. "Quick question for you. Were you by the shop at all last night or this morning?" There was a pause, followed by a world-weary sigh. "Anna, it's 8 o'clock on a Friday. Why would I have been at the shop?" I know, it's just... something's a little off here." "Off how?" He sounded more annoyed than concerned. "The mannequin," I said, the word feeling ridiculous on my tongue. "Florence. She's been moved. She's facing the dressing rooms. I just thought maybe you came by to change the display or something." I could hear him rustling around, probably sitting up in bed. "No, I haven't been there since Monday. You know that." "Are you sure you didn't just knock into it yesterday when you were cleaning?" "No, Mark, this isn't a nudge. The whole thing is turned. It's really weird." I was pleading, hoping he'd hear the panic in my voice. He didn't. "Look, Anna, I'm sure it's nothing. Just turn it back around. I've got a million invoices to deal with today, and I haven't even had coffee. Just fix it." And with a click, he hung up. I stood there in the silent store, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. The feeling of being completely and utterly alone washed over me. I wasn't just alone in the store. I was alone in this, a way that felt profound. He thought I was being dramatic or stupid. No one would believe this. I was on my own. I took a deep, shaky breath and turned back to the main room. Florence stood there, her silent vigil aimed at the dressing room. Waiting. Watching. "Okay," I whispered to the empty air. "Okay. You want me to fix it? I'll fix it." I walked towards her, each step feeling like I was wading through molasses. There was no more denying it. This was happening. It was real. I reached out and put my hands on her fiberglass shoulders. They were cold, smooth, and unyielding. I planted my feet, bent my knees, and tried to turn her. She didn't budge. The base was weighted, designed to be stable, and the mannequin itself was heavier than it looked. It was like trying to turn a statue that was bolted to the floor. I felt a surge of hysterical frustration. "Move, you stupid thing." I grunted, putting my whole body into it. With a low, scraping groan of metal on metal, the bass began to turn. The sound was awful, like a bone grinding in its socket. I wrestled with her, my palms sweating against the cool plastic, inch by painful inch. As she rotated, her blank face swept past me, and for a terrifying second, it felt like she was looking right at me. I could feel the non-existent weight of her non-existent gaze. I finally got her back to her proper position, facing the front door, and stumbled back, breathing heavily. My hands were trembling. My whole body felt jittery with adrenaline. I spent the next hour and a half working on pure, terrified autopilot. I refolded sweaters with clumsy fingers, my eyes darting up every few seconds to make sure she was still there, still in her place. The friendly indie folk music I'd put on now sounded thin and menacing. Every creak of the building, every hum from the lights was a new source of terror. The safe, predictable space had been violated. It was now a stage for something I couldn't comprehend, and I was the only audience member. I spent the whole day on edge. Every time the bell over the door chimed, I jumped. Every customer who walked near Florence sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through me. I just wanted my shift to be over. I wanted to be out of there. Finally, at 5 o'clock, my replacement arrived. I practically threw my apron at her and mumbled something about not feeling well. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. As I was gathering my bag from behind the counter, getting ready to flee, a thought struck me. It was a cold, clear thought that cut through the fog of my panic. Proof. I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't going to let this thing, whatever it was, make me think I was. My hands were still shaking, but my movements were deliberate. I pulled out my phone. I walked to the center of the room, standing a few feet back from the mannequin. I opened the camera app. I held the phone up, making sure the framing was perfect. I captured Florence, standing perfectly still, facing the front door. I made sure to get the sales rack to her left and the display table of handbags to her right in the shot. Undeniable context. The timestamp would be embedded in the file. There would be no room for doubt. No more second-guessing my own memory. I took the picture. The fake shutter sound clicked loudly in the now quieting store. I lowered my phone and looked from the perfect image on the screen to the real thing standing in front of me. I leaned in close, my voice barely a whisper, a strange mix of fear and defiance. "There," I breathed, speaking directly to the smooth, featureless face. "I've got you now. Let's see you move one more time. Just try it." I'd like to say I went home and slept soundly, secure in the knowledge that I had my proof, that I had drawn a line in the sand. I'd like to say my little act of defiance made me feel powerful. But that would be a lie. Sleep wasn't on the menu that night. Not real sleep, anyway. I drifted in and out of a shallow, restless state, and every time I closed my eyes I saw her. Florence. Standing there in the sterile light of the shop, her smooth, featureless face aimed at the door. My phone became a talisman of sorts. I must have switched it on and looked at the picture 100 times, the screen's glow cutting through the darkness of my bedroom. There she was. Frozen in time. Frame perfect. The sales rack on the left. The handbag table on the right. Time-stamped. It was my proof. My anchor to sanity. I kept staring at it, as if my gaze alone could hold her in place until morning. The whispered challenge I'd made to her face echoed in my head, but it didn't sound brave anymore. It sounded stupid. Like a child taunting a shadow right before it swallows them whole. What was I even expecting? That a piece of fiberglass would respond to a dare? The rational part of my brain, the part that had aced that sociology midterm, screamed at me. It was Mark. It had to be Mark. He was messing with me. A really, really bizarre and unfunny prank to get back at me for... what? I couldn't think of a reason. But a prank was a million times more believable than the alternative. I clung to that thought like a life raft. It was just a stupid, elaborate prank. The next morning felt like walking through water. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed and raw. The 15-minute walk to the gilded hangar stretched into an eternity. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long. Every rustle of trash in the gutter sounded like a footstep behind me. The city was gray and overcast, fitting my mood perfectly. I got to the front of the shop, my stomach a tight knot of dread. For a second, I just stood there on the sidewalk, key in my sweating palm, staring at the darkened glass. I could just turn around, call in sick, say I had the flu. But then what? I'd have to come back tomorrow, and the not knowing would be worse. Taking a deep, shaky breath that did absolutely nothing to calm me, I put the key in the lock. The familiar metallic sound echoed loudly in the quiet street. Key in. Turn. Click. I pushed the heavy door open. The scent of fabric and air freshener hit me, but it wasn't comforting today. It smelled sterile, like a hospital room. I didn't say my usual silly "morning, Florence." The words wouldn't form. My hand went to the breaker panel, my fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before I flipped the switch. The fluorescent lights hummed, flickered once, twice, and then flooded the space with their flat, unforgiving glare. My breath just stopped. It wasn't a scream that came out of me. It was more like a pathetic little squeak, a puff of air that got caught in my throat. My bag slipped from my shoulder and hit the polished concrete floor with a soft thud. My phone, which I'd been clutching like a rosary, clattered beside it. She wasn't in the middle of the room anymore. She wasn't facing the door. She had moved. There's no other way to say it. She had moved forward. Maybe 10 feet. At least 3 or 4 long strides a normal person would take. The heavy metal base she stood on was no longer in the center of the floor. It was now positioned right at the end of my checkout counter. My counter. The little space that was my command center, my safe zone. For 8 hours a day. She was right there, invading it. A silent plastic sentinel standing guard where I was supposed to be standing. My legs felt like they were going to give out. My mind was a whirlwind of pure, undiluted panic. No, this wasn't possible. I scrambled to pick up my phone, my fingers fumbling on the smooth screen. I swiped frantically, my thumb slipping twice before the gallery opened. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, so loud I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. I opened the picture from last night, and I swear, the world tilted on its axis. The image on the screen was a ghost of a memory. Florence, far away in the center of the room, flanked by her tables and racks. I lowered the phone, my gaze flickering between the screen and the reality standing 3 feet in front of me. The difference was a punch to the gut. It was stark. It was absolute. It was undeniable. My proof. My anchor. And it proved the one thing I didn't want to believe. It wasn't a prank. It couldn't be. To move that thing was a 2-person job. Or one very strong, very determined person. It was heavy, awkward. You'd make a racket, scraping that metal base across the floor. I would have heard it. A neighbor would have heard it. And Mark? He was lazy. He wouldn't go through this much effort for a joke he wasn't even here to see the punchline of. This was something else. And then, I saw her pose. It was different this time too. Subtly, horribly different. Her arms weren't in their usual mannequin-like positions. She was bent slightly at the waist, her upper body leaning forward over the counter. Her blank featureless head was tilted down, as if she were deeply interested in something on the polished surface. As if she were a curious customer, peering at a price tag, or an interesting piece of jewelry. The pose was so intentional, so full of purpose. It wasn't just a random shift. It was a posture, an action, frozen in time. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I felt violated. It was one thing for it to move in the middle of the empty store. It was another thing entirely for it to come to my space. To lean over the counter, where I sat, where I ate my lunch, where I took my calls. The feeling was so specific, so skin-crawling, like the feeling you get when you realize someone has been in your room while you were out. That they've touched your things. Breathed your air. My eyes darted over the counter. The cash register was closed. The little jar of mints was untouched. My half-finished water bottle from yesterday was still there. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. And that, somehow, was worse. This wasn't about theft. This was about me. The thought hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was a game. A sick, terrifying game. And I was the only other player. I started backing away slowly, my sneakers making small, squeaking sounds on the floor. I couldn't take my eyes off her. The way she was leaning, the slight tilt of her head, it was inquisitive. It was observant. It felt like she, or whatever was moving her, had been standing there for hours, just looking, studying my space. My back hit the cold glass of the front door. I flinched, a fresh jolt of adrenaline shooting through me. I needed to get out. I needed to call Mark again. Scream at him this time. Call the police? What would I even say? Hi, officer. The mannequin in my store is moving on its own? They'd think I was high. They'd tell me to lay off the drugs and get some sleep. No one would believe me. The photo was proof for me, but to anyone else? It was just two different pictures. Maybe you moved it and forgot, ma'am. No, I was utterly, completely alone in this. I stood there, pinned between the door at my back and the silent intruder in front of me, my mind racing. I was trapped. I had to stay. I had to open the store in less than an hour. I had to stand behind that very counter, right next to it, and pretend everything was normal. I had to greet customers and handle transactions just inches away from the spot where this thing was now standing. The thought made me feel physically ill, and that's when I saw it. It was a small detail, a tiny thing, something that would have been invisible to anyone else, but I knew. Last night, before I left, I had done my usual closing routine, wiped down the counters, straightened the displays, and, finally, I'd used a bottle of Windex and a paper towel on the glass top of the checkout counter. I'm a bit obsessive about it. Smudges and fingerprints drive me crazy. I'd polished it until it was a perfect, streak-free mirror, but now, under the flat, revealing light of the fluorescence, right on the glass surface where Florence was leaning over, where her faceless gaze was directed, there was a smudge. It wasn't a full fingerprint, not a clear one like you see on TV. It was a greasy, indistinct mark. The kind of partial print left behind when a palm or the side of a hand presses down on a clean surface. It was faint, but it was there. And it wasn't mine. A cold that had nothing to do with the morning air seeped into my bones. The blood drained from my face. The theory that had been forming in the back of my mind, the terrifying alternative to a prank or a ghost, suddenly crystallized into horrible, solid certainty. Florence hadn't moved herself, someone had moved her. A person with greasy human hands had stood right here, in my space behind my counter. They had stood here in the dark, breathing this air, and they had leaned on my counter as they positioned this heavy plastic doll to face it. They had posed it, like a child setting up a toy soldier, a deliberate, silent message left just for me. And they had left a piece of themselves behind. There was no air in my lungs to scream. All of it had been punched out of me when I saw that greasy partial handprint on the glass. My own hands came up to my mouth, one of my nails digging into my lip, but I didn't feel it. The cold from the front door was gone, replaced by a deep, internal iciness that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of absolute certainty, the cold of realizing you are not alone in a locked room. Florence hadn't moved. Someone had moved her. A person, a living, breathing, greasy-handed person had been in here. They had stood right where I was supposed to be standing in an hour. They had leaned over my counter, in my space. They had posed that plastic thing like a sick, silent calling card. A message. I was here. I can get in whenever I want. My first instinct, a frantic and useless one, was to erase the evidence. My hand shot out, grabbing the paper towel from beside the Windex bottle under the counter. Without thinking, I sprayed the glass and wiped. I wiped furiously, scrubbing away the smudge until the glass was perfect and clear again, reflecting the sterile fluorescent lights from above. It was a stupid, panicked reaction, like a child closing their eyes and believing they've become invisible. If I couldn't see it, it wasn't real. But it was real. I could still feel the ghost of it on my skin. I spent the rest of the day in a state of high-strung, silent terror. You know that feeling when you're walking alone at night and you hear a footstep behind you? And you're too scared to turn around, so you just walk faster, your entire back tingling, every muscle tensed for a hand on your shoulder? It was like that. For 8 solid hours. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of a customer's shopping bag, every buzz of the door opening sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. I couldn't bring myself to stand behind the counter for more than a few minutes at a time. The spot where Florence had been leaning felt contaminated. I kept my back to the wall as much as possible, my eyes darting constantly between the customers and the front door and the featureless white face of the mannequin, now back in its proper place after I'd wrestled it there myself that morning, my muscles screaming in protest. I kept arranging and rearranging the same rack of blouses, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind was a screaming chaos. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a ghost. It was a person who knew my schedule, a person who was quiet, a person who liked to play games. The hours crawled by. Around 2 in the afternoon, the stress was giving me a monster of a headache. The loose strands of my hair kept falling in my face as I was trying to fold a stack of denim jeans, and I was getting more and more irritated. My hands were shaking, I just wanted to get my hair out of my eyes, to have one less thing bothering me. I reached into my bag for my favorite hair clip. It was this little metal thing, shaped like a butterfly, a gift from my mom a few years back. It wasn't worth anything, but it was one of those small, comforting things, you know? My fumbling, sweaty fingers couldn't get a good grip on it. As I was trying to pull my hair back, the clip slipped. It hit the polished concrete floor with a tiny tinny clatter. Crap, I muttered under my breath. I bent down, scanning the floor around my feet. Nothing. I got on my hands and knees, my heart starting to patter a bit faster for no good reason. I peered under the display table. The floor was clean, almost sterile. There was nowhere for it to have gone. It wasn't a pin, it was a solid metal butterfly. I ran my hand over the smooth concrete, a feeling of desperation starting to bubble up inside me. It couldn't have just vanished. I'd heard it fall right here. I looked for a full 5 minutes, my movements getting more and more frantic, until a customer asked if I was okay. I stood up, cheeks burning with embarrassment and a fresh wave of anxiety. It was just gone, slipped into some crack in reality. I tried to tell myself it had just bounced into a weird corner, and I'd find it later when I swept. But the loss of it, on this day of all days, felt like a bad omen. That evening, I called Mark. My voice was tight, high-pitched. I tried to keep it steady, but I know I failed. Mark, someone was in the store last night. Silence on the other end, then a weary sigh. What are you talking about, Annie? Did someone break in? Is anything missing? No, that's the thing. Nothing's gone. But the mannequin, it was moved again, all the way to the front counter. And there was a handprint on the glass. I took a picture yesterday, Mark. I have proof it was in a different place. Someone is getting in. The sigh he gave this time was a lot less weary and a lot more annoyed. Annie, listen to yourself. You're talking about a mannequin and a smudge. You're stressed. It's a busy season. You probably moved it to clean and forgot. That thing is a pain in the ass to move, I know, but maybe you just blocked it out. No, I didn't. I would not forget moving that thing across the entire store. Someone is messing with me, Mark. Or, worse, can we please check the security cameras? That's when his voice got cold. That flat, manager tone that means you've crossed a line. The system in that location records over itself every 12 hours to save on data costs. You know that. It's company policy. There's nothing to see from last night. Look, I don't have time for this ghost hunting nonsense. If you're going to call me because the register is short or the store is on fire. Not because you think a doll moved. We can't afford to have paranoid employees scaring the customers. Get some sleep. And don't call me about this again, or we're going to have a very different conversation about your future at the Gilded Hangar. Do you understand? I understood. I was on my own. I hung up the phone, feeling smaller and more foolish than I ever had in my life. He'd made me feel like a crazy person. Maybe I was. Maybe the stress was getting to me. Maybe I was hallucinating handprints and disappearing hair clips. The next morning, I was so tired I felt stoned. The dread I felt walking to the shop was a heavy, physical weight on my shoulders. I was just numb. I put the key in the lock. The sound deafeningly loud in the morning quiet. Click. I pushed the door open, braced for the worst. And at first, nothing. The fluorescent lights flickered on, humming their familiar tune. Everything looked normal. Perfectly. Blessedly normal. Florence was standing right where she was supposed to be, dead center in the middle of the floor, facing the door. She wore the new silk blouse and skirt I dressed her in yesterday. A wave of relief so powerful it made my knees weak washed over me. Thank God, it was over. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe I was just losing it. I had been so wound up, so paranoid, the relief was so intense, I actually let out a little, hysterical laugh. I was okay. The store was okay. I tossed my bag onto the counter and started my opening routine, feeling lighter than I had in days. It wasn't until I walked past Florence to get to the stockroom that I noticed. It was a small thing, a detail, her pose. It was slightly different. Yesterday both of her arms had been down at her sides in a neutral, relaxed position. Now her right arm was different. It was bent at the elbow, held out in front of her. Her plastic white hand was turned upward, palm facing the ceiling. An open, waiting, offering gesture. It was weird. It was another little change meant to unsettle me. But after the terror of the past few days, a simple change of pose felt manageable. The game was still on, apparently. The jerk was still getting in, but at least the mannequin hadn't marched across the room this time. Small victories. I walked closer, my eyes narrowed. The pose was just unnatural for a mannequin. It looked deliberate, like she was holding something, or waiting for something to be placed in her hand. A purse, maybe? But the handbags were all on the other side of the store. I stopped about a foot away from her, peering at that smooth, upturned plastic palm. And that's when my blood ran cold. That's when the fragile little bubble of relief I'd built around myself didn't just pop, it exploded, leaving me naked and trembling in a universe of pure, unadulterated horror. Lying there, nestled perfectly in the center of her white plastic palm, was my butterfly hair clip. I didn't scream, I didn't run, I couldn't. My feet were nailed to the floor. My breath hitched in my throat, and just stayed there, a painful, useless lump. My vision narrowed, until the only thing in the entire world was that small, metal butterfly, glinting innocently under the harsh lights of the shop. My clip. The one I'd dropped yesterday. The one I'd searched for on my hands and knees. The one that had vanished. It hadn't vanished, he'd picked it up. The thought didn't just come to me, it slammed into me with physical force. He was here yesterday. While I was working. He must have been hiding somewhere. In the stockroom. In the bathroom. Watching me. He watched me fold the jeans. He watched me get frustrated with my hair. He watched my clip fall, and he watched me search for it like an idiot. And then, after I left, after I locked the door thinking I was safe, he had come out. He had walked through my store in the dark. He had taken my clip, my personal, worthless, sentimental clip, and he had placed it in the hand of this thing. A trophy. A message. A taunt. It wasn't a game about moving a doll anymore. It was about me. He saw me. He was watching me. He was picking up the things I dropped. My eyes darted around the silent, empty store. The rows of silent, watching clothes. The dark maw of the stockroom door at the back. The small, claustrophobic bathroom. It had never felt so large and so full of hiding places. The silence was the worst part. Before, it had been empty. Now it was a listening silence. A waiting silence. I stood there, frozen, staring at the butterfly in Florence's hand. And a new question, a far more terrifying question than any that had come before, bloomed in the frozen wasteland of my mind. He was here last night. He had to be. But how could I be sure that he had left? I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been 10 seconds or 10 minutes. Time just sorta stopped. The whole world shrank down to the size of that stupid metal butterfly sitting in that stupid plastic hand. It was an anchor, pinning me to that exact spot on the floor, and a hurricane, tearing apart every rational thought in my head. He'd watched me. He'd been there, somewhere in the quiet corners of the store, while I'd been on my hands and knees, frantic, my face probably red with frustration. He had watched, and he had waited. My first coherent thought wasn't about calling the police. It wasn't about running. It was a cold, pragmatic, and utterly insane thought. I have to work. I have to open the store in 20 minutes. What am I supposed to do? Tell customers, sorry, we're closed today because a ghost is leaving my personal belongings on the mannequins. So I did the only thing my terrified, shattered mind could think of. I went on autopilot. I walked over to Florence, my legs feeling like they were moving through deep water. My hand trembled as I reached out and plucked the butterfly clip from her palm. The metal was cold. I shoved it deep into my pocket, the familiar shape a burning spot against my thigh. Then, with a grunt of effort that felt like I was trying to move a mountain, I grabbed Florence's arm and forced it back down to her side. The plastic joint scraped and groaned in the silence. Now she was neutral again. Back to normal. See? Everything's normal. I spent the next 8 hours in a state that I can only describe as functional catatonia. I unlocked the doors. I turned on the music. I greeted customers with a smile that felt like a Halloween mask stapled to my face. I rang up sales and folded clothes and answered questions about sizing. But I wasn't really there. The real me was backed into a corner of my own mind, screaming. Every time the bell over the door chimed, my heart tried to hammer its way out of my ribcage. I never turned my back on the main floor. The storeroom door, which I'd never given a second thought to, now looked like the mouth of a cave. I kept inventing reasons to walk to the front of the store, to rearrange the scarves by the window, just so I could be sure the door was still locked. Around 4 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was Mark. My stomach twisted into a knot. "Annie," he said. His voice already tired and annoyed, like my very existence was an inconvenience. "Just calling to remind you it's the last Tuesday of the month. You've got to stay and do the end-of-month inventory count tonight." The air left my lungs. "Tonight?" "Mark, I can't." "What do you mean you can't? It's your shift." "It has to be done tonight so the numbers are ready for the morning report. It's not a request." No. I mean, something's come up, I said, my voice barely a whisper. My eyes were glued to the storeroom door. A family thing. It's an emergency. It was the worst lie I'd ever told. He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of pure exasperation. Annie, I don't have time for this. We talked about this. You're on thin ice with this whole paranoid mannequin thing. Don't start making up excuses now. You need this job, right? So be a team player. Get the inventory done, and lock up. It shouldn't take you more than a couple of hours. I'll see the report in my email tomorrow. The line went dead before I could protest again. That was it. I was trapped. The thought of being in this store, alone, after dark, with him, with whatever he was, it was so terrifying, I felt physically sick. For a wild moment, I considered just grabbing my bag and walking out. Just quitting. But then, the reality of my life crashed down on me. Rent was due next week. My car needed new tires. I couldn't afford to be brave. I couldn't afford to be scared. I had to stay. The last customer left at 6 on the dot. I locked the door behind them, the click of the deadbolt echoing in the now silent store. The friendly, bright daytime space immediately transformed. The racks of clothes became rows of silent, watching figures. The shadows in the corners grew longer, deeper. And in the center of it all stood Florence, her featureless face aimed right at me. A silent warden. Okay, Annie, get it together, I whispered to myself, the sound of my own voice startling me. Just get it done. Fast. I started at the front. I had a clipboard and a pen, and my hands were shaking so hard I could barely write. T-shirts. I counted them, my lips moving silently. 12 small, 15 medium, 10 large. Check. Denim jackets. 8. Check. I moved through the store like a machine, forcing my brain to focus on the numbers, on the mundane task, on anything but the suffocating silence and the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the old floorboards was a footstep. Every hum from the small drink fridge behind the counter was a low growl. The distant sound of a siren on the main avenue made me jump so badly I dropped my pen, and the clatter it made on the concrete floor was like a gunshot. I left the storeroom for last. I dreaded it. The door was slightly ajar, a black slit of nothingness. I took a deep breath, pushed it open, and flicked on the single, bare bulb that hung from the ceiling. It was cramped, filled with cardboard boxes, extra hangers, and the faint, dusty smell of old fabric. I did the count as fast as I possibly could, my back pressed against the wall, my eyes darting around the crowded shelves. I didn't see anything out of place. No sleeping bags, no food wrappers, just boxes and dust. Maybe he wasn't here now. Maybe he only came in after I was gone for the night. The thought offered a tiny, pathetic splinter of comfort. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I was done. The clipboard was full of my shaky handwriting. I practically sprinted to the counter, shoved the clipboard into my bag, grabbed my jacket, and made for the front door. I didn't even bother turning off the main lights. I just wanted out. My fingers fumbled with the locks. I unlocked the deadbolt, pulled the heavy glass door open, and stepped outside into the cool night air. I turned and pushed the door shut, then locked it again from the outside. Click. I was out. He was in, maybe. But I was out. A thick pane of reinforced glass stood between us. The relief was so intense, so overwhelming, that I leaned my forehead against the cool glass and closed my eyes, just for a second. I was safe. That's when I heard it. It wasn't loud. It was a tiny sound, almost imperceptible. But in the quiet of the empty street, it was as clear as a scream. A soft, scraping creak. It came from deep inside the store. From the back. From the direction of the storeroom. My blood turned to ice. My breath hitched. He was in there. Right now. He was moving around. My first rational thought was, burglar. Someone broke in while I was in the back. That had to be it. My hand flew to my pocket, my fingers scrambling for my phone. They were slick with sweat. I pulled it out, my thumb shaking as I tried to swipe to unlock it. Call 911. Just call 911. I took a step back from the door, away from the glass, fumbling with the screen. And then I made the mistake of looking up. I looked back into the store, my eyes scanning the familiar layout under the fluorescent glow. The racks of clothes. The counter. The central display area. The central display area was empty. The spot where Florence had been standing just a few minutes ago was now vacant. My brain stalled. It just stopped working. I couldn't process the information. Did he move her again? So quickly? Where did he put her? My eyes darted around the brightly lit space, searching for the familiar, lanky, white shape. And then, I saw the movement. It wasn't from the corner, or from behind a rack. It was from the black, rectangular maw of the storeroom doorway at the very back of the shop. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness within. A human shape. A man. He was tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes that made him blend in with the shadows. He didn't run. He didn't sneak. He just walked. He walked out of the storeroom with a slow, deliberate pace, his feet making no sound on the concrete floor. He walked across the back of the store and then turned, heading for the center of the room. He walked right to the very spot where the mannequin was supposed to be. And then he stopped. My phone slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the pavement. I didn't notice. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I could only stare. He wasn't a burglar. A burglar would be grabbing things, rushing. A burglar wouldn't walk to the dead center of a store and just stand there. He stood perfectly still, his body oriented toward the front door, toward me. A living, breathing man, occupying the space of a plastic doll. The streetlights from behind me cast my own terrified reflection onto the glass, and through it, I could see him. A dark silhouette against the bright interior. He didn't rush the door, he didn't smash the glass, he didn't scream, he just stood there, watching me. And then, he did something that shattered the last remaining piece of my sanity. Slowly, with a smooth, almost unnatural fluidity, he tilted his head to the right. It was the exact same motion, the same curious, questioning angle that I had seen on Florence that very morning. The pose that had looked so strange and deliberate on the mannequin. But this wasn't plastic. This was a person. A predator, mimicking its lure. Under the harsh, sterile lights of the shop, I couldn't see the details of his face. It was just a pale oval, a blur of features. But I could see his eyes. They weren't eyes. They were just two dark, vacant holes, like the painted-on eyes of a doll. And they were fixed, unblinking, directly on me. For a second that stretched into a cold eternity, the world was silent. It was just me on the sidewalk and him in the store, a pane of glass between us, a predator and its frozen prey. My phone was on the pavement somewhere near my feet. The cool night air didn't touch my skin. My own reflection stared back at me from the glass, a ghost with wide, terrified eyes, and through it, I saw him. The man who wore the mannequin's pose. The living doll. The dark, empty sockets of his eyes were locked on mine. My mind wasn't forming thoughts anymore, just static. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears. I was going to die here, on this empty street, and my last sight would be this impossible thing. Then, the world came roaring back to life. A pair of brilliant, piercing lights flooded the street, sweeping across the front of the store. A low grumble grew into the roar of a heavy engine. A massive delivery truck, one of the late-night haulers, was making a wide, slow turn onto our little side street. The headlights hit the glass storefront and blasted the interior with pure, white light, erasing my reflection and illuminating him with brutal clarity. For the first time, I saw him truly move. It wasn't the slow, eerie tilt of his head. This was a flinch. A genuine, human-like reaction of surprise and retreat. The light caught him and he recoiled, not like a startled animal, but like a creature of the dark suddenly exposed. He took one, single, swift step back, melting away from the central display spot and disappearing into the black doorway of the storeroom just as quickly as he had appeared. He didn't run, he just dissolved into the shadows. The spell was broken. I didn't make a decision. My body made it for me. The part of my brain that had been screaming in silence finally took control of my limbs. I didn't bend down for my phone. I didn't even look back at my purse, which was still on the ground where I dropped it by the door. Adrenaline, pure and raw, dumped into my system like a bucket of ice water. My legs, which had been rooted to the spot, suddenly unglued themselves from the concrete. I turned and I ran. I ran in a way I hadn't run since I was a child, a clumsy, desperate, all-out scramble for my life. My lungs burned instantly, sucking in the cold air in ragged gasps. The sound of my own sneaker slapping against the pavement was deafening in the quiet street. After about 10 feet, a sound tore its way out of my throat. It wasn't a word, it was just a noise, a high, thin wail of pure terror. Then it became a scream. I was screaming as I ran, my voice cracking, shouting for help at the dark, silent windows of the apartments above the other shops. Help! Somebody please, help me! The delivery truck rumbled past me, the driver probably glancing over, seeing some hysterical girl running down the street, and shaking his head before continuing on his way. I didn't care. I just kept running, not daring to look back, fully expecting to feel a hand grab my shoulder at any second. I ran until I reached the corner of the main avenue, where the comforting glow of streetlights and the occasional passing car felt like a sanctuary. I stumbled to a stop there, hands on my knees, gasping for air, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. I finally risked a look back down the dark street. It was empty. The store was just a box of light in the distance. He wasn't following me. A light flicked on in a window above the bakery next to my shop. A silhouette appeared. Then another light. My screaming had done it. Thank God. A man's voice, muffled by the glass, yelled down, "Hey, you okay? What's going on? Call the police." I shrieked back, my voice raw. "There's someone in the store! He's in the shop!" I saw the silhouette disappear from the window. I stayed where I was, tucked into the relative safety of the brighter street, shivering, hugging myself, watching the little storefront down the block as if he might just walk out the front door. The minutes crawled by like hours. Finally, I heard the distant but unmistakable sound of a siren. It grew louder and louder until a police car, lights flashing, swung onto the street and screeched to a halt right in front of the shop. 2 officers got out. One was older, with a tired-looking face and a thick mustache. The other was younger, more energetic, with his hand already resting near his sidearm. I ran back toward them, my legs still wobbly. "He's in there," I gasped, pointing a shaky finger at the door. "I was locking up. I saw him inside. He came out of the storeroom." The older officer, whose name tag read Miller, looked at me, his expression calm and professional, probably sizing me up, trying to see if I was drunk or high. "Okay, miss, take a breath. What did you see?" "A man. He was standing where the mannequin is supposed to be. He was just standing there, watching me." The words sounded insane, even to my own ears. "I have a key." I fumbled in my jacket pocket, pulling out the spare. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't fit it into the lock. The younger officer gently took it from me, unlocked the door, and they pushed it open, guns drawn. "Stay out here, miss," Miller said firmly, before following his partner inside. I waited on the sidewalk, chewing on my thumbnail, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could see their flashlights cutting through the interior, sweeping across the racks of clothes, behind the counter, into the changing rooms. They were in there for what felt like forever. Then, they came back out. "There's nobody in there, miss," Miller said, his voice flat. "We checked everywhere. Storeroom, bathrooms. The back exit is a solid steel door, bolted from the inside. There's no sign of forced entry." The world tilted. "No," I whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a denial. "No. He was right there. I saw him. He came out of the storeroom. He was tall, thin, in dark clothes." The younger officer, whose name was Chen, looked at me with a hint of pity. "Ma'am, the storeroom is packed wall to wall with boxes. There's barely room to turn around, let alone hide. Are you sure you didn't maybe see a shadow? The lights can play tricks on your eyes." Tears of frustration and fear started to well up. "I'm not crazy," I insisted, my voice trembling. "He was there. He moved my hair clip. He's been moving the mannequin for days." They exchanged a look. The look. The one that says, "We've got a nut job on our hands." Miller sighed. "Okay, look. Let's just take one more look in that storeroom with you. You can show us exactly where you saw him come from." I nodded numbly and followed them back inside. The store felt different with them there, less threatening, but the memory of the man's vacant stare was burned into my mind. We walked to the back, to the storeroom. Chen flicked on the single bare bulb. "See?" he said, gesturing to the cramped space. "Nothing, just boxes." But Miller wasn't looking at the boxes. He was looking up. "Hey, Chen, look at that." He pointed his flashlight at the ceiling. High up, in the corner, was a square metal grate for an old ventilation shaft. It was covered in dust and grime, but on the edges you could see it. Fresh scratch marks on the metal frame. One of the corners was bent slightly outward. "Well, I'll be damned," Chen muttered. He dragged over a stepping stool and climbed up, shining his light into the shaft. "It leads up to the roof. Grate's been pried open from the inside. That must have been his way in and out." A wave of vindication and pure, cold dread washed over me at the same time. I wasn't crazy. He was real. He was real, and he had been coming and going as he pleased. And then Officer Miller's flashlight beam fell on something in the far corner of the storeroom, behind a tall stack of cardboard boxes filled with last season's sweaters. "What the hell is this?" he said. He squeezed past the boxes, and I crowded behind Chen to see. In the corner, tucked away in the deepest, darkest part of the room, was a small, dirty nest. A couple of grimy-looking old blankets were piled up to make a makeshift bed. Next to it were empty instant noodle cups, a few plastic water bottles, and a crumpled bag of chips. He hadn't just been coming and going, he had been living here, sleeping here, mere feet from where I worked every single day, separated only by a hollow wooden door. I felt sick, my stomach churned, and I thought I was going to throw up right there on the concrete floor. "He was living in here," Chen said, his voice now stripped of all pity and filled with a low, angry disbelief. He knelt, careful not to touch anything. His eyes scanned the small, pathetic pile of trash. Then he saw it, half tucked under one of the blankets, as if it had been dropped in a hurry. A cheap, black, prepaid cell phone. A burner phone. "Bingo," Chen said softly. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves from his belt pouch, carefully picked it up, and pressed the power button on the side. The screen flared to life. No password. It opened directly to the home screen. He tapped on the gallery icon. He was silent for a moment. Then he let out a short, sharp breath. "Oh, Jesus Christ!" Miller leaned over his shoulder. "What is it?" "Get her out of here," Chen said, his voice tight. "No," I said, stepping forward. "What is it? What's on the phone? I need to see." Chen looked at me, his eyes full of a new kind of pity, a much deeper and more terrifying kind. He hesitated, then turned the screen toward me. My breath caught in my throat. The gallery was full, hundreds of photos. But they weren't photos of mannequins. They were photos of me. Candid shots, all of them. Me at the counter, frowning at the computer screen. Me on my lunch break, eating a sandwich, my head tilted back as I drank from a can of soda. A blurry shot of me laughing at something on my own phone. A shot of me from behind, reaching up to adjust a display on a high shelf. They were all taken from inside the store, from strange, low angles, from behind racks of clothing, a few from the slight crack in the storeroom door. He had been watching me, documenting my every move, every boring, mundane moment of my workday. He'd been there, in the shadows, with his camera. I felt my knees go weak. Miller put a steadying hand on my arm. "That's enough," he said gently. "Let's go." But my eyes were glued to the screen. Chen, his face a grim mask, was swiping through them with his thumb. Swipe. A picture of my back. Swipe. A close-up of my hands folding a sweater. Swipe. Swipe. Then the background changed. It wasn't the store anymore. The lighting was wrong. It was dim, yellowish, like a streetlight seen through a window. The photo was slightly grainy, taken from a distance. It was me, sitting on my couch in my apartment, watching TV. My heart stopped. "No," I whispered. Chen kept swiping. Another picture. Me in my kitchen, getting a glass of water. The angle was from outside, looking through the kitchen window. He had followed me home. That was a horrifying thought. But it wasn't the last thought. It wasn't the worst one. Because Chen swiped one more time, to the most recent photos at the very end of the album. The picture was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of my alarm clock on the bedside table. It was a picture of my bedroom. It was a picture of me, asleep in my own bed. The angle was taken from outside my second-story window. Through the glass you could see my face, peaceful, oblivious, and utterly vulnerable. There were more than a dozen of them. He wasn't just living in the store. He hadn't just followed me home. He had been outside my window. He had been watching me sleep. The police didn't find him. He had slipped out the vent and disappeared onto the rooftops, into the night. But he had left his collection behind. His tribute. All his pictures of me. The man from the shop wasn't in the shop anymore. He was out there, somewhere. And he knew where I slept.